Hall and Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hello and welcome back to our Building Better Boards and Leaders podcast, where we examine the key issues facing boards and executive leaders. I'm Susie Lees, Corporate and Commercial Partner at Hall & Wilcox and co-lead of our Beyond Compliance initiative. This is part 2 of our podcast episode discussing employee fraud and corruption with Julian Hammond and David Catanese. In this episode, we'll cover what directors can do to try to prevent employee fraud and corruption from occurring, how to implement a strong workplace culture of integrity and transparency, and provide some tips on how to deal with worst-case scenarios. We hope you enjoy the episode. We might talk a little bit more now, I think, about how we set that tone from the top all the way through the organisation to manage that integrity and transparency and oversight piece. And certainly from my perspective, specialising in corporate governance, I always think about this in terms of directors and what should they be doing and how can you prevent this sort of issue from happening in the first place? What's the level of the inquiring mind? How do we set that tone from the top around culture and respond to these issues as well to address those stakeholders and minimise that loss of trust and that damage to reputation? And Dave, I'm curious to know your thoughts from a workplace culture perspective. How does that play a part in supporting the ethical behaviours of reporting and encouraging that? And what systems do you put in place for clients to support that strong workplace culture of integrity and transparency?
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, look, culture is so important at organisations. And, you know, we're not talking about whether it's a nice place to work and people have morning teas. We're talking about, you know, how seriously do people take their obligations in the workplace, you know, from a governance and regulatory transactional management perspective, right down to the individual responsibilities of, you know, employees, bookkeepers, project managers, you know, anybody really whoever comes across an invoice, inward or outward in the organisation, are they doing what they need to be doing? And in my experience, I tend to see if a client comes to us with an issue, if you look at the structures they've got in place, that usually looks pretty good. You know, there's lines of management, there's reporting obligations and so forth. But invariably, once we sort of look under the hood, what we see is that these are not processes that are being followed or enforced. And usually it's something where things have been done in the same way for quite a long period of time, and there's been no issue, and there's a bit of complacency there. And often it's in those circumstances where a fraud is uncovered and it's been going on at a fairly low level for years. And so in terms of culture, it's really about, well, how serious is this organisation about committing to and implementing the policies that it already has? You know, it's already decided that these things are good, these things are right, and are going to be helpful and reduce risk. But how vigilant are they about implementing them continually and reviewing and auditing and improving? So culture is huge because it needs to be an environment where somebody can say to the bookkeeper who's been there for 20 years, yes, we need to audit what you've done in the past year, without that being a big issue. You know, is that something that is accepted, or a nose is going to get out of joint? Because that's where we see these frauds arising, where I was going to audit so-and-so's work this year, but it just would have created issues, so we didn't do it. And that's when frauds can go unchecked for a long period of time. So culture is so important. You really need to normalise, yes, it's okay for us to have these checks and balances. If we audit someone's, you know, a project, for example, and invoices that have come in and gone out and how that's proceeded, you're not pointing fingers. It's a really ordinary process for that audit to occur. And in fact, everybody understands that it's healthy and will protect the business overall. You know, that's the culture piece. Does everybody accept that those sorts of regulatory and auditing measures are okay or not? And you know, that's huge. If the culture is right, if everybody's aware, no one's taking it personally that there are checks and balances, I think you're going to eliminate these issues almost entirely, or they'll at least be by exception. You know, if someone's going to steal from you, hard to control that. But if you're creating a culture where it's going to be very difficult for someone to do that, they probably won't.
Yeah, and I think the flip side of that, and it's such a great point, is that culture of making honest mistakes that are reported quickly and rectified is okay. And the other side of it is, from an employee perspective, that can protect them as well. You know, if you want two people signing off on financial transfers, for example, that protects them to make sure that yes, it's going to where it's supposed to, and no, they're not going to be in the firing line later on, which I think is really important. And from a board perspective, again, I think that gives you comfort that there are appropriate oversight and checks and balances in place, which can be a matter of some really simple practical measures in terms of, you know, risk frameworks that don't have to be so complicated. Sometimes they're as simple as a two-person sign-off on a bank account. Julian, what about you? Have you seen some lessons learned in terms of what not to do, or what you've seen done well to prevent or respond to these issues of fraud and corruption?
Yeah, thanks, Susie. I think the key thing is, as we said earlier, not to be reactive, but I think there's some really basic priorities that need to be implemented in terms of having an organisational response when there is a risk raised about potential employee fraud. I think, as Dave alluded to earlier, the first priority is to lock down systems and really safeguard information. And then you need to be speaking to your advisors early as well, because your threshold issue is putting your employee on notice before completing an investigation, and handling that employee investigation, any show cause and termination notice is imperative, and that's where Dave kicks in. At the same time, you should be checking your insurance policies to see whether you have cover and the notice you need to give to an insurer to be able to potentially recover some of your legal costs there, or costs associated with it, or whether they're fraud losses that are covered as well. And really, where we work in tandem with our friends, either at the corporate end yourself, Susie, or at the employment end with David, is to work out whether to appoint external forensic investigators. And those investigations can include carrying out property and company searches and looking at real estate dealings of the employee. And that will really lead to the legal demand seeking recovery that normally follows a termination, and whatever form that would take, and whether there are associated, as I said, Anton Pillar orders or Mariva orders that are put in place there, or whether there's even, an option to look at, engagement with banks and recovery and freezing bank accounts or third parties, and whether third parties might be liable for compensation in certain situations where, they've received funds and, where there might be accessorial liability. So, those are the key kind of things that I think are the lessons learned. That's your best case scenario of how to approach things, and for the key risks to be aware of, and when to engage legal advisors. You don't want to be precluding yourself from civil recovery by going straight off to police. As Dave said, you don't want to be precluding yourself from being able to obtain further information from individuals in relation to, putting them on ice or terminating them. So again, it's that strategic, methodical approach that steps through that best case kind of scenario approach as to how you would eventually get yourself in a position to maximise potential civil recovery in those circumstances. Look, obviously there are circumstances where that may not be the case, and then referral off to police for investigation and prosecution may be the best outcome. But ultimately, for organisations, the recovery of some of the funds is going to be far more important, certainly depending upon the size of the fraud.
And this is such a great topic when you think about it from the board investigation piece, and what you're talking about as well, Julian, when things do get down to that pointy end. I always think about this in terms of what the board ends up dealing with and the mess they end up having to pick up the pieces of, where we often do the board investigation piece as an independent advisor, and the questions always is, what went wrong? How did this happen? What corporate governance was not there to stop this, and what management and risk frameworks were not in place. And David, I'm sure you see this too, and I always think prevention is better than cure. But let's talk about that pointy end of things and worst case scenarios, and what do you do when you are in this scenario, some of which we see in the media? What happens when the alleged fraud is by an employee? What do boards immediately need to do from a workplace perspective? And does it make a difference who the person is? Is it worse when it's a senior executive?
Yeah, it's a good question, Susie, and I think it does make a difference who might be, the perpetrator of a fraud, I think it's worth also recognising that the organisation in this circumstance is a victim of a crime. And, that needs to be recognised, because although there are, front end obligations on boards and management as well to prevent these types of issues arising and mitigate risks, there's somebody who's committed a crime and the organisation is a victim. So, I think that that's important to take into account. By the same token, it's a really serious crime. And the criminal courts have told us over recent years and continue to tell us that if somebody commits a financial fraud, of the type that we're talking about, whether it's siphoning funds or dodgy invoices or whatever the case may be, where it's more than a nominal sum, somebody's going to jail if there's a prosecution. So these are really serious crimes. And that's the context that we're looking at if one of these things comes up at an organisation. So to create the hypothetical, there's a fraud has been identified. Perhaps there's those steps that Julian spoke about. There's been some investigations, insurers have been contacted and so forth. And there's some idea perhaps who's been involved. Maybe you don't know the full story, but a picture has been painted. If it's an employee, let's say it's a bookkeeper, which is often the case, or somebody in the accounts area, has their access been removed? What is their employment status? Have they left the organisation already? Sometimes we see these things come up after somebody has engaged in a fraud and left an organisation, and things come up later. Is that the case? Are they a contractor? What is their level of management? Do people report to them? Who do they report to? What is their ongoing reporting obligations? If this person is stood down, or potentially dismissed, what is the business continuity? Have you got somebody else who can actually continue to perform that function as well? So these are really important considerations. The next layer is, well, who's responsible for overseeing this person's work? Have other people been involved knowingly? Was somebody turning a blind eye? Or, as is often the case, we find that there may be a level of negligence by, line managers and potentially up into the executive suite. Who is ultimately responsible for auditing these financial functions and who has not picked this up. And that's where we often see a board becoming directly involved with respect to, the senior executive under whose remit, these frauds may have occurred. Obviously, if a person in the C-suite has been involved, then that's going to be more serious and have greater ramifications for the business. Probably also could be telling of a more serious fraud at that level. Where we've seen senior executives involved in these types of frauds, often we are talking about, more serious corrupt behaviour, often with respect to the awarding of contracts and things like that. Different types of corruption than, dodgy accounts and things like that. When it comes to considering what to do with these types of employees, well, there are those other interests we spoke about earlier, the financial interests of the organisation, making sure things aren't getting worse and so forth. But then, well, what do you do with people who've been involved in these types of frauds? Well, you exit them. Once you've got what you need and it's safe and you've protected the financial interests of the organisation, you exit, which can usually be done pretty swiftly. Certainly be speaking to lawyers about the process to make sure you're on the right path, but usually it's relatively straightforward so long as you've got some good information. Theft from an organisation will almost always be serious misconduct warranting summary dismissal. And in fact, for those employees to whom the Fair Work Act applies, which is most in Australia, theft is included in the definition of serious misconduct that can justify summary dismissal. So the pathway to exit is usually pretty clear, but you want to make sure that you've shored up the organisation's position, got everything you need from the employee before doing that. We find that where there has been good evidence of an employee fraud, that the likelihood that that employee will bring a claim with respect to their dismissal is very, very low. And part of that can be because of the risk of criminal prosecution if these things come to light as well.
There's some fantastic tips from a practical workplace perspective. Thank you, David. And Julian, from your perspective as well, as a litigator, if you do have that CEO or employee in the firing line, in the gun, so to speak, how does the board handle that allegation? What should they do?
Look, I think obviously a myriad of considerations that apply for a board here, but to be short and sweet about it, I think one of the most important things that a board should be doing is empowering general counsel and necessarily legal department and external solicitors who are engaged as advisors to really ensure that there is a properly structured investigation that maximises the prospects that the reports or the outputs are protected by privilege, but also it keeps the board appropriately informed. So I think, the board should be really saying the general counsel that they should be periodically reporting the results of the investigation to the CEO if the CEO is not implicated or not the figure who has been conducting the fraud, and or the board to ensure, if it is the board, the direct reporting to avoid that CEO relationship, or that the CEO is temporarily put on ice for purposes of the investigation, then that's the way to go. So I think one of the most important things is to ensure the preservation of confidentiality and the integrity of investigation really for future civil or criminal proceedings. And so really enabling, the board should be looking at empowering the CEO as necessary and the GC as well to establish a properly structured investigation to ensure that their options, that suite of options available to them remain open, but also that there is that chain of communication from the GC about periodically reporting the results of the investigation up to the board as well.
Thanks, Julian, and thanks everyone for listening today. As always, please get in touch with us if you have any questions. You can find our details on our website, which is hallandwilcox.com.au, or connect with us on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed today's episode, then rate, review, or follow our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.